Truth Espresso, episode 354.
In a world gone bonkers.
It is not, generally speaking, unruly, but fires have been started and...
Where the culture is a dumpster fire.
We're coming for your children.
And churches have lost their way.
I am really uncomfortable with the story of the crucifixion.
It's time to wake up with Truth Espresso.
Truth Espresso.
Your weekly shot of truth. And now your host, Daniel Minnick.
Well, hello there, friends, family, foes, and, of course, lurkers alike. This is your host, Daniel Minnick, for yet another exciting episode of Truth Espresso. And it's been a few weeks since we last did an episode of our walkthrough through the Book of Mormon, so I think it's about time that we get back to that. And if you like stories, well, finally in this episode of Truth Espresso, it's going to be pretty much all story from the Book of Mormon. I know that we would encounter large sections of the Book of Mormon that would mostly just be doctrine, well, not so much doctrine as just revivalist sermons. And so in this episode, we're going to kind of take a break from that, as the next chapters in the Book of Mosiah in the series are going to be narrative story. And in the last episode of the series, we ended with Mosiah chapter 18. And now, because it's been a little while since that last episode in this series, I'll just give a little refresher on the story of the Book of Mosiah up until now. So, around 124 BC, somewhere in ancient America, King Benjamin of the kingdom of Zarahemla was nearing the end of his life, and he passed the crown to his son Mosiah in an outdoor revivalist sermon. The people were named the children of Christ. Yes, remember, all of this stuff about Christ was before Christ's first advent. Now, 3 years later, after crowning his son Mosiah king, King Benjamin had passed, and King Mosiah sent a small band of men up to the land of Nephi to find out what happened to some other ones who went up there before, since they hadn't heard from them. Of this band of men that King Mosiah now sent up to find the land of Nephi, there was a warrior named Ammon and his 3 brothers. And as this band of men entered the gate of Nephi, the Nephite king Limhi arrested them for trespassing. And after 2 days in prison, they stood before King Limhi and basically said, "We're from Zarahemla, and we know of your grandpa Zeniff." So then everyone was happy, because the land of Nephi was at this time under a heavy tax burden to the Lamanites. With the kingdoms of Nephi and Zarahemla combined as kindred, they could fight to free themselves from the Lamanites. And King Limhi also had Ammon read some records of the past 100 years, kind of to be up to date on what had been going on in the land of Nephi. And King Limhi also had some ancient records of the Jaredites written in a language that only an interpreter or a seer could interpret. Now, Mosiah chapters 9 through 22 are the record that Ammon read. And that means we're backtracking things a bit. This record starts with Limhi's grandfather Zeniff and goes until a little after the time Ammon met with King Limhi here. And that means that Limhi must have had a scribe write things down that happened as Ammon and his brothers came to the land of Nephi. The record continues even after this, as Limhi's scribe must have continued to chronicle the ongoing events. At least that's what I'm suggesting must have happened, if I'm going to give the benefit of the doubt here. So King Limhi's grandfather Zeniff was eager to build up and prosper in the land of Nephi with the people he took from Zarahemla. and they had some victories over the Lamanites, but ultimately made a compromise with them. And Zeniff's son Noah became a sinful and lavish king, taxing the people and building structures for his own ego. Now a prophet named Abinadi openly preached against the sins of the king and the people, and prophesied that bad things would happen to them. King Noah imprisoned Abinadi and demanded that he recant. Instead, Abinadi preached to him about what the law of Moses meant and that it pointed to Christ. And I talked about some of the modalistic doctrinal problems in Abinadi's teaching. So King Noah still sent Abinadi to die, and as Abinadi burned to death, he prophesied famines and plagues and bondage from the Lamanites. One of King Noah's priests, named Alma, believed Abinadi's sermon and escaped for his life. He made disciples of about 450 people of Nephi and started an assembly called the Church of Christ, and he baptized many of them in the waters of Mormon. And King Noah got wind of this and tried to arrest these potential troublemakers, but they fled into the desert. And this is where we now pick up the story in Mosiah chapter 19. So King Noah's soldiers returned to him in vain. They didn't find any of the fugitive church members. His army was dwindling and a schism began to form. A small group of King Noah's soldiers then openly began to rebel and speak badly against King Noah. And verse 3 of Mosiah chapter 19 says that they began to breathe out threatenings against the king. Now that expression sounds a little to me like Acts 9:1, where Saul was breathing out threatenings and slaughter against the church. One of the men of this anti-King Noah schism was named Gideon. How original. Gideon also swore in his wrath that he would slay the king. Now, Joseph Smith, I note, sure seemed to like to say a lot that someone or some group of people swore in their wrath. He seemed to like this particular clause. Now, a form of that shows up in only 3 verses in the Bible, and all 3 of these verses were about God saying that rebellious Israelites would not enter into his rest. Yet, in the Book of Mormon, it seems that everyone swears in their wrath. Oh well, I just like to point out some of these nuances that I notice, especially when Joseph Smith borrows phrases and clauses and sentences from the Bible and seems to obsess over some of them. One of them is that people swear in their wrath a lot. So it seems that this soldier named Gideon and King Noah had kind of a sword duel. But Gideon, of course, was a much better swordsman and chased King Noah onto a tower outside his temple. And while on this tower, King Noah noticed that Lamanite armies were gathering in the outskirts of the land of Nephi that was called Shemlon. And he begged Gideon not to kill him because of the threat of the Lamanites. Verse 8 gives a commentary that says, "And now the king was not so much concerned about his people as he was about his own life." Now that doesn't sound very King Jamesy to me, but what do I know? Well, Gideon then did let the king live, and then King Noah told the people to flee to the desert. So instead of fight the Lamanites, he told them to flee to the desert, and he also told the men to leave their wives and children behind and to flee with him. And now this seems to show that he was only concerned with his own safety and he didn't want to be bogged down with protecting women and children. And of course, understandably, some of the men refused the king's orders to flee with him, and they stayed with their wives and children. Now, some of the men who stayed behind with their families told their youthful daughters to confront the Lamanites and plead to spare their lives. And the Lamanite warriors were smitten with, cuteness aggression or something, and so they let them and their families live. And instead of killing them, they captured the families and let them live in the land of Nephi, as long as they paid a tax of half of everything they owned and produced. How gracious of them. Now, they also had to hand over King Noah, so Gideon sent some other soldiers as spies into the desert to find King Noah. And they found the men who fled, but they didn't find King Noah or any of his priests. The men they found were prepared to return to the land and avenge their families if the Lamanites had killed them. They didn't seem too happy about what they were doing just for the sake of King Noah. So when King Noah, who was probably hiding out of sight, learned that the men planned to return to the land of Nephi, he told them not to return. He obviously wanted them there with him just to protect him. And this kind of became the final straw, and the men caused King Noah to die by fire, just as Abinadi had prophesied. Abinadi had said in Mosiah 12, verse 3, that it shall come to pass that the life of King Noah shall be valued even as a garment in a hot furnace. Wow, what amazing prophecy, right? So, after that work was finished, the men began to return to Nephi to confront the Lamanites. And Gideon's men explained that their families are still alive and that the Lamanites let them live in the land as long as they pay tribute of half their stuff. So the combined entourage returned to the land of Nephi. And the men who had fled with King Noah told the men of Gideon that they killed the king. The king of the Lamanites swore that they will continue to let the Nephite people live in the land. King Noah's son Limhi also swore in return that they would pay the 50% tax. So there began to be some form of peace in the land, and they all lived happily ever after, right? Paying a hefty tax to the Lamanites. Yeah. So this arrangement went on for 2 years, and that's the end of Mosiah chapter 19. So let's move on to Mosiah chapter 20. Remember that the men who fled with King Noah got frustrated with his selfishness and killed him? Well, they returned to the land of Nephi, but what about King Noah's priests? Weren't they still out in the desert somewhere? Yeah, let's not forget about them. So remember the area in the outskirts of the land of Nephi called Shemlon? A small group of young Lamanite women gathered in Shemlon to sing and dance and celebrate. The priests of former King Noah were afraid to return to their families in the land of Nephi because they were kind of ashamed at what they had done, and they thought that they might be killed like King Noah was killed. So the priests secretly watched these Lamanite women celebrating for a while and then decided to capture them and bring them into the desert. Well, that's not going to be good for the peace agreement between the Lamanites and the Nephites. Once the Lamanites found out what happened to these women, they thought King Limhi was responsible for this. So the king of the Lamanites gathered an army and marched with them near the land of Nephi. King Limhi saw this happening from the tower near the temple and assembled an army to watch from the woods. And as the Lamanite army came near, King Limhi's army ambushed them, and a raging battle happened. The Lamanites greatly outnumbered the Nephites, but the Nephites fought with such intense vigor. The Book of Mormon describes them as like lions and fighting like dragons. And Limhi's men emerged victorious. The Lamanites that fled left their king as if he were among the casualties. And the Nephite soldiers found the Lamanite king wounded among the corpses, so they covered up his wounds and brought him captive. And they asked King Limhi if they could kill him. But Limhi told them not to kill him, but to bring him before him. And basically the conversation went a little like this. So King Limhi says, "Why did you attack us? I thought we made an agreement that you would let us live in our land and we would pay you half of our stuff. We've kept our end of this bargain. Why didn't you keep yours?" And Lamanite king says, "Your people captured some of my women. What did you expect me to do?" And King Limhi says, "Well, that's news to me. Let me see if I could find anyone here who knows about this. And I assure you that whoever's responsible for this will die." Gideon, who was now King Limhi's captain, says to him, "You don't need to investigate the people here. Remember the priests that fled with King Noah? Trust me, they're the culprits. Now let's explain this to Kingy over there so he doesn't send another army, because they would certainly crush what remains of ours. Remember how outnumbered we are?" So King Limhi tells the Lamanite king what really happened. And the Lamanite king says, "I'll tell you what, you guys come with me to bring me back to my people. I know I will look like a hostage, but if you come unarmed, I promise you I will make sure my people don't attack you." So, as he said, they met the Lamanites and returned their king. And the Lamanite king explained the matter, and they departed in peace, and they all lived happily ever after, right? Well, let's see what happens in Mosiah chapter 21. So, with perhaps a little less than a year of peace, the Lamanites began to get angry at the Nephites. Because of the promise not to kill the Nephites, the Lamanites figured they could just kind of rough them up a little and make them do some slave labor. And some of the Nephite people started to get angry with King Limhi and demand that he let them go fight the Lamanites. And after enough complaints, King Limhi basically said something like, "Go do whatever you want." So they armed themselves and tried to fight the Lamanites and get them out of the land of Nephi. And the Lamanites won and killed some of them, making their lives more difficult. Women and children mourned the loss of their husbands and fathers. And this caused more complaints to King Limhi, and yet more men wanted to drive the Lamanites away. And they failed again with an even bigger loss. The oppression from the Lamanites became greater, and yet more men tried to fight the Lamanites. And the few men that survived that third fight returned to the land and were so dejected that they willfully subjected themselves to the whims of their Lamanite overlords. And the burden and sorrow began to be so great that some of the Nephites humbled themselves before God and begged for deliverance. You know, I would feel sorry for these poor Nephites, except that the story just didn't happen, so... Okay, let's continue, shall we? As was prophesied, the Nephites would cry out to God because of their afflictions, but God warned that he would be slow to hear their cries because of their sins. Yet God did provide some relief. He wouldn't deliver them from the Lamanites yet, but he would soften the hearts of the Lamanites a bit to relieve the burden of slavery. So the Lamanites let up on treating the Nephites like animals, and they became more prosperous. They still had to pay that harsh tax, but things were getting a little easier for them. King Limhi ordered that the men contribute to help out the orphans and widows that had lost men as casualties in those battles. By this time, King Limhi was a little cynical about the Lamanites because of the recent battles, so he kept guards with him at all times, and he wouldn't leave the walls of the land of Nephi without these guards. And he hoped that he could sometime find the priests who had captured the Lamanite women and punish those priests for their actions for causing such a calamity on the land of Nephi over that misunderstanding.
How is your flame of truth, Christian? Is it burning bright? Hi, I'm Rebecca Berschwinger, creator and host of One Little Candle, a weekly podcast dedicated to encouraging, empowering, and equipping believers to be the light that God has called us to be, so that we may pass down undefiled the truth of God's infallible word to the next generation. So join me and light your own little corner of the world. You can listen to One Little Candle on all major podcast platforms or at christianpodcastcommunity.org.
So then, this record retells the story of when Ammon and his men arrive at the land of Nephi, while King Limhi happened to be outside the gates and had them arrested. Remember when that happened? Ammon was imprisoned 2 days later. He explained to King Limhi that they were from Zarahemla, and he had sent a small band not prior to find the land of Zarahemla. So people going from Nephi to Zarahemla, and then there are people from Zarahemla looking for the land of Nephi. So then, remember, they all celebrated that the lands of Nephi and Zarahemla were kin and could combine forces to drive out the Lamanites. And Limhi was also excited that Ammon knew of someone who could interpret the ancient record that he had found that would turn out later to be a record of the Jaredites who moved to the Americas from the Tower of Babel. So Ammon and his people from Zarahemla and King Limhi and his Nephite people made a covenant with God. King Limhi and many of his people wanted to be baptized, as the record of Zeniff narrated about the Church of Christ that Alma had started. There was just one problem. No one there had the authority to baptize. Alma and his church had fled into the desert when King Noah had threatened them. It seems King Limhi had asked Ammon if he could do the honors, and Ammon was like, "Don't ask me, I don't have that kind of authority." So they were left waiting on the Spirit of God, and they didn't have authority to organize a church or have anyone baptized. Until they could find Alma or someone with this authority, they had to be patient. So instead of waiting to be baptized to join the church, they focused on their plans for organizing the alliance between the lands of Nephi and Zarahemla. And that brings us to chapter 22. So after some masterful plotting and scheming for how to overthrow the Lamanite bondage, King Limhi and Ammon realized they kind of had nothing. They were overwhelmingly outnumbered for any fancy football play. The only solution would be to journey into the desert with some stuff and head for Zarahemla. Now, Captain Gideon had an idea. He told the king that he noticed that the Lamanite guards on the backside of the city seemed to get drunk every night, and they could leave for Zarahemla that way, and he would help this happen by yucking it up with the Lamanite guards and giving them more wine to get plastered. King Limhi gave the thumbs up on this plan, so Gideon delivered the wine to the guards as a gift from the king, and King Limhi sent some people and their flocks and herds to the backside of the city and made a roundabout trip by the outskirts of the land of the Lamanites called Shalom. Remember, the outskirts dwelling near the land of Nephi was called Shemlon, and the outskirts dwelling near the land of Laman was called Shalom. I'm going to quiz you all on that somehow. Okay, so Ammon and his brothers knew the way to Zarahemla, and they led the people there. And once there, these Nephites with Ammon and his brothers became people of King Mosiah, so they joined the Zarahemlites. They were all happy because they could combine their records and get an annotated history of both of their lands. And once the Lamanites figured out what happened, an army of them went into the desert to look for the Nephite fugitives. And after 2 days, this Lamanite army found themselves lost in the desert. And now that brings us to Mosiah chapter 23. And this chapter and the next chapter are accounts of Alma. So, yes, we return to Alma and his church in the desert when they were fleeing from King Noah. So, once again, in the book of Mosiah, we kind of have to move forward, then shift backwards, and move forward, then shift backwards. And it's kind of hard to piece together a perfect chronology here. But I guess, according to this part of the Book of Mormon, we have to learn about a lot of things that were happening at the same time. So yeah, it's time to jump back in time a few years again. Because remember, King Limhi and the people there really wanted to be baptized, but no one there had the authority to do it. So we must find out what happened to Alma and his church to see if maybe this authority for forming a church and baptizing were still available. I mean, come on already. We couldn't have it any other way, right? So somewhere in the desert, Alma and his church were starting to build a little civilization. The people wanted to make him their king, but Alma refused because God said, "Ye shall not esteem one flesh above another, or one man shall not think himself above another." Yeah, there are clear echoes of 19th century American constitutionalism in this mentality here around 145 BC. But Alma also explains something like, remember King Noah and his sins and his bad priests? Yeah, that king thing doesn't seem to be working out so well for us, does it? But look at the freedoms you're now enjoying in this little desert city with no king. And then in verse 13, Alma said, And now as ye have been delivered by the power of God out of these bonds, yea, even out of the hands of King Noah and his people, and also from the bonds of iniquity, even so I desire that ye should stand fast in this liberty wherewith ye have been made free, and that ye should trust no man to be a king over you. So I've just got to comment on this verse a little bit because there are some things that I kind of recognize here. So the phrase, the bonds of iniquity, sounds to me like it comes from Acts 8:23, where the Apostle Peter told Simon the magician, For I perceive that thou art in the gall of bitterness and in the bond of iniquity. How original, Joseph Smith. And if stand fast in this liberty wherewith ye have been made free rings a bell, I would submit that this is very much plagiarism from Galatians 5:1, where the Apostle Paul wrote, Stand fast therefore in the liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. Oh, but the Book of Mormon was translated from ancient records written in Reformed Egyptian, and this part was before the New Testament. Yeah, just try me. I dare you to convince me that this stuff happened before Peter and Paul said these things. So, verses 16 and 17 in Mosiah chapter 23 start to explain something we need to know in this narrative. So these verses say, And now Alma was their high priest, he being the founder of their church. And it came to pass that none received authority to preach or to teach except it were by him from God. Therefore he consecrated all their priests and all their teachers, and none were consecrated except they were just men. So see where this is going. At some point, we have to have that priesthood authority get back to the main camp so that the people of Nephi and Zarahemla could join the Church of Christ and get baptized. Of course, remember from the last episode in this series the question I raised. If these priests truly taught and practiced the law of Moses, how did they get such priesthood authority in ancient America anyway? Before Jesus established the new covenant, priesthood authority was with the tribe of Levi. Yet Limhi, who started all this stuff in ancient America, was a descendant of Joseph. So, of the tribe of Ephraim or Manasseh, perhaps? But where was there any priestly authority possible in the land of Nephi or Zarahemla, according to the Bible? Well, Mormonism today teaches that Limhi had the priesthood of Melchizedek and was not bound by the law of the priesthood of Aaron. Yeah, I don't buy that explanation. If you believe the Bible and you read the book of Hebrews, only Jesus is priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. No one else. The Bible never mentions anyone else holding the priesthood of Melchizedek before or after Christ. There was no concurring priesthood of Melchizedek in Israel along with the priesthood of Aaron. So I would submit that the claims that there was a legitimate priesthood before Christ in which people could have a priesthood authority that didn't come from the priesthood of Aaron, of Levi in ancient America is simply nonsense. Well, anyway, enough of this rant. Back to Mosiah chapter 23. So, the city that Alma and his church built in the desert, they named Helam, and that's the same name as one of Ammon's brothers. The people there needed to endure trials, but verse 22 says, "Whosoever putteth his trust in him, the same shall be lifted up at the last day." Now, this sounds to me kind of like John 6:40, where Jesus said, "That every one which seeth the Son and believeth on him may have everlasting life, and I will raise him up at the last day." Now, the Lamanite army that was looking for the people of Limhi and got lost in the desert that I mentioned earlier found the priests of King Noah who had captured the young Lamanite women. Of course, as you would expect, the priests had married these Lamanite women and were farming an area in the desert. One of the priests, named Amulon, was the leader of the bunch. Amulon begged the women to plead with the Lamanite soldiers to spare them, and the Lamanites had compassion and agreed. Amulon and his fellow priests and their Lamanite wives joined the Lamanite army to find the land of Nephi again. Along the way, they stumbled on the land of Helam, where Alma and his church were, and some people of Helam were farming prosperously in their city in the desert when they noticed this army of Lamanites coming near. So they got scared and gathered in the city. And Alma told them not to fear and that God would protect them. So did they have a masterful plan to escape or fight off these Lamanites? Well, they prayed that God would soften the hearts of the Lamanites, and they surrendered themselves and their land to the Lamanites. And the Lamanites told Alma that if they led them to the land of Nephi, they would be set free there. So Alma directed the company toward the land of Nephi. However, the Lamanites broke their promise. Some of them went to the land of Nephi, and others fortified the land of Helam and made the priest Amulon a vassal king over the city of Helam. And that ends chapter 23, so now we will begin to conclude this episode as we get into chapter 24. So, the Lamanites now controlled the land of Nephi and its outskirts settlement Shemlon, and they controlled the new lands of Helam and Ammon. The only place they didn't control was, of course, Zarahemla. The Lamanites began to prosper a lot, and they set up vassal kings in these territories. They also appointed teachers, kind of like setting up an educational system. And the Lamanites actually at this time became a peaceful people, and they engaged in trade with the Nephites and learned the language of the Nephites. But the Lamanites still remained a secular people. However, Amulon, as a Lamanite appointed priest king, remembered that he had a gripe with Alma. If you remember, Alma and Amulon were both priests of former King Noah. However, Alma believed the message of Abinadi and escaped King Noah's sentence on him and started the Church of Christ. And Amulon was one of the priests that went with King Noah into the desert and was one of those who captured the Lamanite women and caused a lot of problems for the people of King Limhi in the land of Nephi. So there was obviously some bad blood between these two priests of former King Noah. Amulon began to use his Lamanite-appointed authority to oppress Alma and his followers. He turned them into slaves. And when Alma's people cried out to God, Amulon sent out guards to kill anyone who dared do that. So the people then asked Alma secretly what they should do. Now, God heard their cries and at first made them somehow able to bear their labors much more easily. Now, I don't know if it was supposed to be like super strength or super endurance, but they wouldn't feel the pain of their labors. And eventually God revealed to Alma that he would free them from this slavery. So that night, Alma told the people to gather their families and animals to leave. In the morning, God caused the Lamanite guards to fall into a strong state of REM sleep so that the people could escape into the desert. And that evening, they set up tents in a valley in the desert, and they called that valley Alma because, of course. After celebrating their freedom a bit, God told Alma that the people needed to continue moving because the Lamanites woke up and they were coming after them. And if the people continued moving, God would ensure that the Lamanites would only reach the valley of Alma. Eventually, after 12 long days of trekking in the desert, Alma and his people found the land of Zarahemla, and King Mosiah gladly welcomed them there. And thus ends the record of Alma after the record of Zeniff. And just think, King Limhi and his people had escaped to Zarahemla before Alma and his church escaped the Lamanites and the priest king Ammon, and now Alma and his church were there in Zarahemla. Remember that King Limhi and his people desired to be baptized and join a church, but that no one had that authority? Well, now Alma and his church have come to save the day. Yay, finally someone has priestly authority to baptize the Nephite people at Zarahemla. And what awaits the people of Nephi and the people of Zarahemla now that they are all joined together in the land of Zarahemla? Will they find a way to drive away the Lamanites and free the land of Nephi again from heavy taxation? Now, you could read the last few chapters of the Book of Mosiah to find out, or you could stay tuned to more episodes of Truth Espresso in the continuing walkthrough of the Book of Mormon, and God bless.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Truth Espresso. Be sure to subscribe and rate it on your favorite podcast app. Truth Espresso is a member of the Christian podcast community. Check out other great faith-building shows at christianpodcastcommunity.org.